It's my pleasure to introduce you to Make Good the Promises, Reconstruction and its Legacy. Our focus in the exhibition is to look at Reconstruction through the eyes of the newly freed, to find out what it meant for them to escape slavery and to begin to create new lives for themselves. The passage of the 13th Amendment was an important moment in the history of the country, because for the very first time, slavery was no longer the law of the land. And it meant for these newly freed individuals, they had a chance to craft a new life for themselves, to find a new pathway they could follow as they went forward. As Frederick Douglass said, the hope was that they would be left alone, be able to make their own way without interference. The reality is, though, is it wasn't quite that simple, that there was opposition along the way that they had to fight through, but fight through they did. And they didn't do it alone. That help also came through the federal government, who passed legislation such as the 14th and the 15th Amendment, but also created agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau, whose task was to serve as a middleman between the newly freed and those who would be opposed to or own the land that they would try to either gain control over or work on. But most of this work was done by the freed people themselves as they looked to recraft their place, their role in that society. The first section of our exhibition is called America Without Slavery. And the environment we have created is a space that looks like a dilapidated house in the South that suffered from the Civil War, but also is suffering from the demise of slavery, because that is the focus of our area here, the demise of slavery, and what it's meant for the individuals who were once enslaved to now be free. The larger conversation here, though, is what are they going to do? What will the newly free do with this new status in society? Will we get justice? Will we get land? Will we be protected? These are all issues that are at the foremost in the mind of these individuals. We want to highlight what they're thinking, but we also want to make sure that the visitor is aware early on that there's opposition that's arising. There are individuals who do not want them to be free. There are individuals who do not want to treat them equally, and those voices are here as well.
This section of the exhibition is about the Freedmen's Bureau, which played a significant role in the events of Reconstruction. In March 1865, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau. This federal agency operated in 15 states throughout the South between 1865 and 1872. It provided aid to newly freed men, women, and children as they began to build new lives after slavery. Through their interactions with the Freedmen's Bureau, African Americans sought to secure the things that they needed to build new lives as free citizens, including land, family, education, and justice. This section also includes information about the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, known as the Freedmen's Savings Bank. The Freedmen's Bank was not part of the Freedmen's Bureau, but was a private company chartered by Congress at the same time in March of 1865. The idea behind the bank was to provide African Americans with a safe place to deposit their money. But due to mismanagement and corruption on the part of the bank's white trustees, the bank ultimately failed and collapsed in March of 1874. The failure of the Freedmen's Savings Bank had a devastating impact on African American families and communities, and was a harbinger of the difficulties and discriminations that African Americans would continue to face as they tried to build economic security and wealth in the coming generations.
Welcome to the family section of the exhibition. This section highlights the efforts of the newly freed to create, nurture, and protect their families as they desired. As newly freed people reunited and established their families, they set up households. A home of their own, furnished with their own possessions, signified freedom, security, and success. Welcome to the land and labor section. Economic independence was crucial for the newly freed. They appreciated that control of their own land and labor was a solid foundation for self-sufficiency. For African Americans coming out of slavery, freedom meant the opportunity to take control of their educational, religious, economic, and social lives. To achieve this, they established independent institutions such as schools, churches, businesses, and associations. These institutions provided infrastructure for the African American community and refuge from oppression. Of all of the things that freedom signified to the newly freed, the right to educate themselves and their children was one of the most prized. During Reconstruction, access to education became a key measure of African American progress towards equal citizenship. African Americans led the movement to make public education a right, not only for themselves, but for all citizens. And the first Black colleges and universities in the South were founded during Reconstruction. As Black men gained the right to vote and run for office, many ministers also became leaders in local, state, and national politics.
We're now in the section of the exhibition entitled Visions of Freedom, Democracy. During Reconstruction, African Americans gained new civil and political rights, including the right to vote and hold elected office, equal protection under the law, and legal recognition as U.S. citizens. These rights were initially established and protected at the federal level through sweeping changes to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection, due process, and birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from restricting the right to vote based on race. Between 1865 and 1876, over 1,500 African American men served in public office in Southern states. They were state senators and representatives, justices of the peace, sheriffs, superintendents of Board of Education, lieutenant governors, and more. Perhaps the most visible example of African American political gains during Reconstruction was the election of the first Black U.S. senators and representatives to Congress. For the first time in history, Black men served as the nation's lawmakers. Throughout the South in late 1865 and early 1866, Black men and women held conventions to protest their treatment by the governments of the former Confederate states, which had agreed to abolish slavery, but then enacted Black codes, laws which restricted the rights of formerly enslaved people. Freedmen's conventions drew national attention to the injustice of the Black codes. And in response, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, under which African Americans gained the right to vote in the South and participated in state constitutional conventions where they wrote new laws guaranteeing equal rights to all, regardless of race. Also in the democracy section, we have a video entitled Women and Equal Rights, which looks at how African American women defined and asserted their political status during Reconstruction. As we talk about the gains toward political equality that African Americans made during Reconstruction, we also talk about the efforts to oppose, deny, and roll back those gains. Efforts to construct Black political power and create a multiracial democracy were challenged and resisted by those Americans who sought to reconstruct white supremacy. The widespread use of violence, fraud, and intimidation to suppress Black voting in the South, combined with the federal government's reneging on its promise to defend and enforce Black civil rights, allowed white supremacists to regain control of state governments in the South. As a result, Reconstruction ends not with democracy, but with a system of widespread racial discrimination, Jim Crow, that relegated African Americans to second-class citizenship.
Welcome to the Legacy section of the Make Good the Promises exhibition. While the earlier sections of the exhibition focused on the visions of freedom African Americans in the late 19th century used to enact their questions about how they would be free and equal citizens in the United States, the Legacy section focuses on the reverberation of those struggles and on the reverberations of the limitations placed by a racist society on those visions of freedom. In the mass incarceration section, we look at the legacies of race and incarceration in America, a nation where 2/3 of its prison population are made up of African Americans and mostly men. And we spotlight the story of Angola Prison. In particular, we look at the lives of the Angola Three, men who were imprisoned in solitary confinement for the longest period of American history on the site of Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana, a place that was once a slave plantation. When we ask visitors to think about the questions of reparations we look at the case study of Georgetown University as a lens through which many institutions, including colleges and universities, are grappling with the responsibility they have toward repairing a past. We look at the question of civil disobedience and racial justice through the lens and life of Bree Newsom and her act of removing the Confederate flag from the State House of South Carolina 1 week after a horrible racial massacre at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We also look at the question of the lost cause, which was a mythology built in the immediate aftermath of the South's loss of the Civil War, but continued right through the 20th century. In the story of the lost cause, we display 2 windows that were dismantled from Washington's National Cathedral that had celebrated figures from the Civil War who fought for slavery.
One of the most important legacies that still challenges us as a society is the issue of racial profiling. The issue of voter suppression was an important question during Reconstruction, and it remains a challenge for us in today's society. And no better is that illustrated than through the work of Stacey Abrams, where she, in Georgia, looked at trying to find strategies to allow everyone to have the right to vote. The other aspect of Reconstruction that continues to be a challenge for us is a question of violence directed towards African American institutions, when people find them a threat because of what they stand for and how they allow African Americans to organize themselves. We find the same problem plaguing us in today's society, and it's most strongly illustrated through what happened at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston.
To conclude the experience, visitors are invited to reflect on the stories that they encountered, the triumphs and gains of Reconstruction, as well as the promises yet to be fulfilled. In this section, visitors are asked how they would reconstruct America. We are the beneficiaries of the gains of Reconstruction. And as historical actors in our own ways and in our own time, we are called upon to be the leaders, to make good the promises. What will you do?